first we'll have all the presentations, and at the end we will be taking all the questions. So I really don't want to take more time away from them, so I will start by introducing them very briefly. First we have Eva Dyer, assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Georgia Tech and Emory University. Hi, Eva.
Hi.
We have also Evgeny Burnaev, associate professor in the Center for Computational and Data Intensive Science and Engineering and Skolkovo University. Grace Lindsay, postdoctoral fellow in the Sainsbury Wellcome Center and University College London. And finally, Felix Hill, a research scientist at DeepMind. We are also waiting for Ida Momennejad, senior reinforcement learning researcher at Microsoft Research. She was telling me that she was having some health issues, so I hope she's okay. But if we can start, and if she can join, but if she can join us later. So two last reminders. The first one to the panelists, I will be showing like a 5 and 1 minute warning to every presentation, and to the audience, remember that we pinned both the URL and the code in the chat box in which you can send all your questions, and those can be directed to a specific panelist or general to open discussion between them. So welcome, and let's begin. The first one should be Eva.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. So what I'll be talking about today is the work that we're doing in my lab that's sort of centered around representation learning and representation alignment. And I'll sort of describe what that means. But the title suggests that, you know, the idea is that through this alignment or comparison process, we could be able to compare data sets across different time points, across different individuals or space, and also across behavior. Sorry to ask, so if other folks could mute their mics if they haven't already, because I'm getting feedback. All right, great. Oh, perfect. Yeah, that works. So yeah, just to motivate the sort of work that I'll be talking about, a lot of, you know, advances have come about over the past decade or so in experimental neuroscience that have allowed us to now see pictures into the brain and its activity and its structure that we sort of haven't really been able to see at the scale that these new methods enable. So this has created a sort of data deluge, if you will, of a lot of information and recordings coming from the brain, and, you know, scaling up to larger and larger recordings of many and many neurons across different brain regions. So one approach to sort of wrangle all this high dimensional data is this idea of being able to reduce dimensionality or learn sort of lower dimensional representations of the data that allow us to do meaningful inference, right? So dimensionality reduction was sort of perhaps many people are familiar with its application in, say, compression. So image compression comes about through reducing dimensionality by leveraging known structure in natural images and using that to essentially rewrite an image in a smaller set of underlying primitives, so edges, things that we find actually in neural networks at lower layers, like Gabor filters, for instance. Through that compression, we can also get rid of a lot of other things that are happening in the data that might not be relevant to the structure we want to capture. So this allows us to denoise or get rid of other artifacts that don't sort of match the natural structure. And then in unsupervised settings, you know, we are hoping that we can use dimensionality reduction as a way of starting to interpret sort of low dimensional or latent factors that might be driving the activity that we actually observe. Of course, the interpretation piece is much harder because we don't already know what are the structures that are sort of present that might give us this low dimensional representation. So just to sort of set the stage for what I mean by dimensionality reduction in low dimensional models, we'll just consider a general setup where we have a number of samples. So these could be different images, or in the examples that I'll give, this would be different time points. And then our features would be some pieces of information that we have about all the samples. So for instance, with images, it might be pixels. And what I'll talk about today is essentially looking at multiple neurons and their activity as this d-dimensional feature vector, and then looking at how all these samples over time sort of relate to each other. And as I visualized here, the idea is each sample is sort of a point in this high dimensional space. Initially it's d dimensions, but the idea behind dimensionality reduction and a lot of tools like principal components analysis, which are used, throughout data science, is that points aren't everywhere, and instead they tend to lie in lower dimensional subspaces or manifolds, right, of this higher dimensional space. So with that sort of motivation in hand, I won't have time to go into a lot of the ways that we use just representation learning and manifold learning as I've described it. But what I will talk about is this idea of representation alignment. So the sort of premise is, if instead of just having one data set that I found a low dimensional representation of, what if I now have two data sets? And I'd like to understand how they're actually connected to each other, or I'd like to be able to compare these different clouds of points, right? Some applications of this could be, as I'll describe later, maybe across different time points. So you're looking at similar behaviors, but you might have just a different view of it over time. Or perhaps you're looking across disease or other modulations, say of neural activity or of the brain, and then those would generate these two different distributions that you'd like to understand the differences between, right? So this is the sort of general setup for representation alignment, or these ideas that I'll talk to you about. The high level strategy is to essentially have these clouds of points. I would like to figure out that blue matches to blue and red matches to red, but I don't have the colors, right? I don't have labels, but I do know I do know information about the sort of geometry or the local structure and then the global structure that are exhibited between the clouds of points. So just writing this out as a objective function, we basically have a source distribution, which we write as mu. We have a target, which we can write as nu. And then we're trying to learn a transformation of our source in order to match a target under some divergence measure. And there's actually many ways of writing this problem, making assumptions on different aspects of it. So, what divergence or what distance will you use? What class of transformations might you consider depending on the structure? And what underlying structure could we leverage in the data or the target in order to solve this problem? Because in high dimensions, it's very hard to solve this without additional constraints. So with that being said, because much of this is driven often by applications, the general setup that I've described is quite, why it could be widely applicable in different settings. But I'll talk about now the application to distribution alignment of neural activity, or neural distribution alignment. And the setup is as follows. We're basically recording neural activity from a non-human primate while they're doing a reaching task. So they're moving a joystick to different directions, and you can record the neural activity from primary motor cortex in this case, while you're also able to see the sort of underlying distribution of the movements in this two-dimensional like velocity or kinematic space. And, the goal of brain decoding in general is just to figure out a mapping between neural activity and these underlying movements. In the context of what I've described, this sort of distribution alignment strategy, what this means is that we don't need to have correspondence between, neural activity and the low dimensional projections, right? So if we can do this in a distributional sense, then we don't need to have training data that tells us direct correspondence between neural activity and movement. So really the sort of idea here is to, in a simplified version of it, first embed neural data into a low dimensional space, in this case using a linear technique, factor analysis. And then we want to try to bring this neural data into alignment with this underlying target or movement distribution. So learn this transformation T that brings these two into alignment. And so the solution, at least in, a kind of recent paper, and we've been building upon this sort of idea that was presented at NeurIPS last year, is something called hierarchical Wasserstein alignment. In this case, we can leverage both structure in the data, so the fact that these reaches and different behaviors tend to be clustered in space. We leverage additional structure in the class of transformations to make this a tractable problem and one that we can provide some guarantees for. And then finally, we use an entropically regularized Wasserstein divergence as a way of actually measuring distances. What I'm showing here on the left and on the right are neural activity patterns from two different animals that are basically carrying out the same movement distribution or movement target. And what we show is that you can actually take both of these neural activity patterns, align them onto the same target, which is essentially enabling a type of a cross-subject alignment in this case. We can also apply this into other animals and into other types of behaviors. So we've started to look at, in collaboration with Keith Hengen's lab at WashU, using this sort of alignment technique to think about how to align different sleep versus wake cycles so that you could actually compare data sets more directly. This is just showing how easy it is to get these rotations and transformations across different time points, and how we can use this technique to bring the data sets into alignment in a way that's more meaningful than other approaches like, say, canonical correlations analysis, which is shown on the bottom. I have to go through a lot of this quickly. So this is showing, that we can use the same approach kind of generally when we have this clustered structure. But in general, right, we would like to be able to solve this problem sort of in an end-to-end manner, right? And so, what I showed before was essentially using a two-stage procedure, right, to do dimensionality reduction and then to solve this alignment process. I also have no idea how much time I have left. I didn't get any warnings or cues, but so yeah, just interrupt me. So so basically the goal, right, if we go back to our original distribution alignment problem, is to essentially find this transformation of our source onto a target. But in reality, the original source is actually higher dimensional, right? So we'd like to find a transformation T that will go from the high dimensional to the low dimensional space, where we can then solve this alignment problem. We, of course, as I sort of described before, having additional structure that we can leverage and use to regularize this problem is super critical. And when we use a neural network to then actually, sorry?
So you have 1 minute left.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so when we use a neural network then to transform this data, it's actually very powerful, very expressive, and so we do need to apply additional constraints onto this embedding procedure. So these are still preliminary results to try to solve this fully, where you would get dimensionality reduction and alignment. What we found thus far is that by essentially regularizing the latent space to solve multiple different tasks simultaneously, we can actually solve this alignment process. So in this case, asking it to be an autoencoder or reconstruct neural activity or classify, as well as solve this alignment task. And this is just an example of how we could use a neural network to essentially converge to this underlying target across multiple iterations of training. And yeah, so in summary, I talked about, just this idea of using dimensionality reduction to get these latent embeddings of high dimensional neural data sets. I didn't talk about these things, but just we've been doing a lot of work along these lines, which I show here. And then the bulk of what I talked about was this idea of representation alignment, including our work in Highlevel, which we have code for online. Feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in using it, and just a preview on using deep learning for solving this problem in a simultaneous way. So just acknowledgements, the folks that were responsible for doing the work. So Max and Madi in my lab, and then our collaborators at WashU, Keith Hangen's lab, and then funding, of course. And with that, I will finish. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Eva. So we can follow with Ida. Ida, you want to present, and if it works better for you in relation with your medical appointment, if you want to start your presentation, and then we can follow the Q&A session with the other 4 panelists, if you are okay with that.
So I delayed it, so if you would like to continue with the schedule, that's okay with me too, whichever.
Okay.
Do it now or later.
Okay. So,
okay, so I guess my talk is the next, right?
yes.
Okay, that's it. Okay, so so you see my slides, right? Okay, good. So actually, AI and neuroscience is a two-way street. And so, of course, there are a lot of architectures inspired by neuroscience. But in this talk, I'd like to briefly list quite challenging problems of AI application for neuroscience, where we need to solve different neuroimaging processing tasks. And here is some categorization of these tasks. The first type of the standard task is a classification and regression tasks for diagnostics and treatment outcome prediction. And here, let me make an example of quite standard tasks here. The first one is depression diagnostics based on MRI and fMRI data or EEG data, and epilepsy diagnostics based on MRI and fMRI data. We solve these problems in collaboration with medical partners, and actually, although the tasks themselves are quite, standard, these are just classification tasks. But at the same time, there are a lot of challenges here, and we cannot use standard deep learning approaches or just standard machine learning approaches. We need to invent new techniques. For example, in case of epilepsy diagnostics, we are dealing with a significantly multimodal data due to different contrasts of MRI data, due to different resolutions, because radiologists during the inspection, the radiologists need to inspect different contrasts of MRI to understand where the sources of epilepsy are located. And often the labels in these tasks are given not only as semantic labels, which are depicted on the left, but also these labels can be weak and are given by just boxes denoting approximately the place where some epilepsy source is located. But often we even don't have such labels. We only know 0 or 1, that is whether this person has epilepsy or not. Moreover, this type of data can come from different hospitals, and so characteristics of images will be different, and we need to make domain adaptation. Another type of tasks often solved in practice is related to mapping and localization. And this, I would say, very interesting example of such tasks is related to surgical planning in patients with brain gliomas. So the thing is that before a surgical operation, we need to understand where a center, a motor center, or a center responsible for speech, where these centers are located in the brain. And for that, either we do the pre-operative mapping, or we perform the mapping during the operation. Of course, the second type of mappings is the most precise, but in case of the second types of mappings, we need to, open the head, then we need to wake up a patient, then we use electrocardiography to, to try different parts of the brain, and if a patient stops to say something, then we understand that, okay, here a center responsible for speech is located. Of course, we would like to reduce the time when of this precise mapping during the operation. And actually, this can be done using machine learning approaches. The first thing is to apply constraints independent components analysis, because for healthy people, we know where approximately such centers responsible for speech and for movements, where these centers are located. And actually, what is interesting is that independent components, that is, independent signals, which you can extract from brain activity, from fMRI data, and fMRI signals, they can be represented as a combination of these independent signals. So the thing is that these independent signals are correlated with the position of the motor center and the center responsible for speech. And so the first thing is to pre-process fMRI signals, constraints on a position on a prior position of such centers in the brain of a healthy person. The second step in this pipeline would be to apply machine learning to predict using fMRI in a resting state the position of the sensors, which we can identify using fMRI which we obtain under tasks. Because for unhealthy people, it's quite difficult to apply fMRI under tasks, and using machine learning, we can construct such predictive model, which tells us more accurately a prior on where these centers for a specific persons can be located. And so using this approach, we can actually improve the pre-surgical identification of where the centers are located, and this should help for surgery planning. Currently, this type of pipeline is tested in one of hospitals here in Moscow. And one of the next steps would be to integrate it inside the neuronavigation system for online mapping and correcting the offline predictions based on ECOG information during the operation. And the third type of tasks is related to finding dependencies between different indicators and discovered features. And a standard task here would be, for example, to identify, effectiveness and results of rehabilitation in patients with different clinical forms of stroke outcome. And here we should combine different types of data, like clinical data, structural MRI data, and it's very difficult to understand which features really influence which features. And so we cannot consider this task as a simple classification or regression task. And one of another examples of the similar type is another project related to physiological monitoring of cyber sportsmen. So here again we have different sources of data, like EEG data, data from eye tracker, mouse data, keyboard data, also heart rate data, and we need to understand how this correlates with performance when a cyber sportsman plays a game, and to predict and improve the performance. So in conclusion, I want to say that neuroscience poses a lot of challenges for machine learning because we have multimodal data. Not all data modalities can be presented for a particular patient. Labels often are weak and often they are noisy, and we need to develop multi-domain adaptation scenarios and the machine learning models. Moreover, we have to apply different machine learning techniques like topological data analysis, dimensionality reduction, machine learning for graphs, and only this combination can help us to, get good applications for medical purpose. So that's it from my side.
Thank you, Evgeny. So the next one will be Grace.
Okay. My computer is frozen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, but you don't see my slides?
No.
No.
Mm-mm.
Maybe you should select the application.
The window is frozen for me now, so I might need to restart my browser.
Oh, it's a pity. Maybe. Okay,
So,
maybe we listen to another participant, to another colleague.
Yeah. Ida, you want to present now?
Sure. My name is Ida, by the way.
Ida, sorry.
Okay, so let me do this. Do you guys see my wait? Yeah. Okay.
Unfortunately not.
No. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Now yeah, we see your screen.
Thank
but
you.
You're carrying the whole screen of your laptop.
I know. Okay. Now you guys see my screen in a full screen, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so let me start my timer, and please remind me if I'm at 1 minute, and if I don't hear it because I can't see you, so it would be great if you say it out loud.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for organizing this. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my research in multi-scale predictive representations. The kinds of questions I ask is I spend a lot of time thinking what kind of algorithms do brains use. Particularly, the kinds of questions I'm interested in rely on multi-scale and hierarchical representations. For instance, imagine a case where you're going from New York City to Tehran. You might think about this at that higher level of abstraction, or you might think about it at lower levels of more fine-grained representation. Can everyone mute themselves? I can hear somebody's. Thank you. So this is not only sort of exclusive to spatial domains. We have also cooking or playing chess or making social inferences. In all of these problems, the kinds of questions that we ask are, what representational learning algorithms do brains use for memory planning? It's important that these algorithms and the kinds of representations that are learned enable flexibility. For instance, the reward structures can change. Your flight gate might move. The transition structures can change because the subway lines swap, especially in New York City. The approach that I use for this is reinforcement learning. This is one in which an agent takes actions, learns representations, and plans to achieve goals. There's 20 years of work showing that this is a neurally plausible approach. And while we are updating the ways that reinforcement learning is captured by the brain, it's one of the few learning approaches and modeling approaches that is actually neurally plausible. It enables abstraction, hierarchy, generalization, and transfer, making it very attractive for our purposes. Just to give you a little closer up look, the reinforcement learning problem is often mentioned as given a task or a goal in an environment, learn a sequence of actions or policies to maximize value. The well-known algorithms in human reinforcement learning include model-free and model-based reinforcement learning, and the stuff that I use like successor representation or SR-DYNA, which I'll tell you about. The highlight of this slide is that a lot of people make the mistake thinking you always need reward to learn anything in reinforcement learning. But I want you to remember that in model-based and successor representation learning, you can learn a cognitive map or representation of whatever kind of states you're in absence of rewards, because those are learned separately. We'll get to that again. Okay, how do we compare human and artificial reinforcement learning? First, we can compare behavior if we design tasks and compare the behavior of algorithms and humans on the same tasks. Second, once we figure out which algorithms behave like humans, then I look at the representations, either in rodents, in humans, and compare them to the representations that the agent has learned. Do they match? The kinds of representational learning that I have focused on is hierarchical representation learning, in particular in prefrontal and hippocampal hierarchies. There's a bunch of papers, and you can read this recent review if you're interested in learning more. I'll try to say a few things within the time that I have. So first, what do we mean when I talk about predictive representations or predictive cognitive maps? This is related to the idea of learning representations of relational structures. Tolman started this beautifully shown that rodents who learn the structure of the environment without rewards later learn the trajectory to rewards faster. It was revolutionary because it was against the behaviorist dogma of the time in the early 20th century. Later on, since the 70s, we know that there are place cells in the hippocampus, grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, and these sort of structures, together with the prefrontal cortex in humans, are involved in various kinds of navigation, detour tasks, task sets that have nothing to do with spatial processing, and the like. One thing that I focus on is what kind of maps are these cognitive maps? Are they one-step association maps that I need to unroll entirely every time that I make a decision? That would be intractable. That would be very similar to the model-based reinforcement learning, and I'll tell you more about it soon. Alternative is that there would be a compressed representation of multi-step dependency so that I can plan at different scales of abstraction and plan more efficiently. To illustrate the difference between the models, let's imagine that the world is simple. It has 2 trajectories and 6 states, and one of them leads to more rewards. And we are asked the question, which starting state would lead to more reward? Are you going to unroll, or have you stored a compressed representation? On the left, you see a representation that would be used by model-based reinforcement learning, a one-step map of the world where you have all the states as rows and columns. And you can see that the probability of reaching S prime, let's say state 3, if you started from S, let's say state 1 and took an action A, would be stored in this kind of representation. Rewards are stored separately. In the multi-step maps, however, you store the multi-step dependencies with this gamma that's between 0 and 1. Therefore, you have a little bit of a smaller expected future occupancy for step 5 than 3, because 5 is further away, but you have that information already. You don't need to iterate the way you would need to iterate in a model-based. At the moment of decision, in model-based decision-making, you need to iterate with the Bellman equations. You need to value iteration, for instance. You would need to go from 1 to 3 and then 3 to 5, and then combine the values, compare to 2 to 4 and 4 to 6. That's a lot of iterations. For successor representation, you can do just one-step linear combination of the two. There are interesting properties to successor representation. Its rows are successors or what's in the future. Its columns are predecessors or what's in the past. Kim Stackenfeld has beautifully shown that the columns of successor representation correspond to grid place cells in the hippocampus, and the successor representation's eigenvectors correspond to grid cells in the entorhinal cortex. And we have shown with Mark Howard that the derivative of the multi-scale successor representation with regards to the gamma corresponds to distance to goal cells. Now, can we design a task to compare and figure out which representational learning approach governs human planning? That's what I did here in a 2017 paper. On the left, you see a reward evaluation. It's a condition that is very similar to what you saw before in the learning phase. Then there's a relearning phase where people are not starting from state 1 or 2, but they are thrown into state 3 to 5, and 4 to 6. The rewards have shifted, so the rewards have changed. And then there people are asked again, where do you want to go? In the transition evaluation, the rewards don't change, but the map of the world has a partial change. You have transition structures changing. When I drop you back in step 1 or 2 to ask you whether you want to go to 1 or 2, you need to integrate together the information you received here with the information you had earlier to update your map of the world. Otherwise, you'll make an error. Here are the predictions of models. Model-free reinforcement learning, because it needs direct experience in order to update itself, will not be able to do either of them. Model-based would do them perfectly and symmetrically. A combination of model-based and model-free, for instance, a model-based that is training model-free, like the Dino algorithm, would do equally well on both, although it wouldn't do as good as model-based alone. The successor representation alone would do perfectly on reward, because remember, the map didn't change, the reward changed. So as long as we update the reward, we're good. But it can't solve the transition evaluation because it didn't have direct experience to update the map. A combination of successor representation and DINA would predict an asymmetry where people are better at reward evaluation. This is the behavior of humans. As you can see, there is a difference there. There's a lot of other conditions in our paper and more experiments, but for the interest of time, just wanted to show you how we might compare the behavior. We then compared in the fMRI scanner with which are the brain regions where representational similarity from stage 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 can predict if people are going to make an error. So if you've grandfathered the relationship between 1 to 5 in transition evaluation, although the world has changed and now 1 leads to 6, that representational similarity should predict your behavioral error. Turns out regions in the anterior hippocampus, orbitofrontal cortex, and anterior prefrontal cortex are like that. And this was a fortunate finding because this is very similar to my previous work with using decoding in the fMRI to decode future tasks also in the same regions. We also tested this with epileptic patients who had deep electrodes inside their brains. And I designed a VR version of this task where people would open doors, and there's a video of it, but we don't have time to show you. And then I would ask them which room would give you a bigger reward from state 1 or 2. And then I would compare the representational similarity of their neurons while they were in different rooms and have a hypothesis matrix of how things would change, the representational similarity between rooms. How do I expect them to change when there is remapping happening? And would this change predict people's behavior? So I compared the representational similarity that I built from neurons from room to room before and after the transition revaluation condition. And the result is that indeed the changes that we see are in the correct direction. We also looked at this in the virtual reality. So we took data that participants were navigating in a virtual Toronto in the scanner in a goal-directed condition and in a GPS condition. In the goal-directed condition, what we observed was that, what we expected was that people's brains would show representational similarity to states that are further away. In the GPS condition, where just an arrow was telling the person which way to go and they didn't know where they're going, we expected for this to be the representational horizon, the predictive horizon, to be smaller. And so this was the hypothesis that we had, that along the prefrontal hierarchy, we would see that gradient and the hippocampal hierarchy. And I will, so as I mentioned, we would look at the map and compare similarity to nearby or further away places. The distance was up to 1 kilometer, corresponding to different gamma parameters in our model. And what we observed was indeed that there was a hierarchical representation in the direction that we expected. And importantly, it was the higher sort of predictive horizons of 300 meters to 1 kilometer were observed in the anterior prefrontal cortex only in the goal-directed condition when they knew where they were going, when they were using an internal map for that far away. but not in the GPS condition where they could just see a couple of 100 meters, but they didn't know where they're going. There are a number of different studies in this field, and I recommend that you go and take a look. There's a potential possibility that the success representation might offer a general principle for memory organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Aida. And you want to go next, Grace? Let's check if you can share your screen now.
I'll try. Okay, seems like it's working. Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the concept of attention and how it's defined and studied in both neuroscience and machine learning. And so basically, I'm just going to be hitting on a few of the topics that I talk about in this review that I wrote this year, which basically tries to define attention in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning, and describe how these different concepts and these different fields interact and where there's overlap and where there's not overlap, and also kind of where there could be more overlap or more inspiration in the future. So if you're interested in this, there's a lot more in the review than I'll be able to talk about now. But so for this review, I had to define attention, which is notoriously difficult because basically it's defined many different ways, both within each of these different fields, and then obviously across the different fields, it has a lot of different definitions. But something that I came up with that I think describes a lot of what people mean when they talk about attention is the ability to flexibly control limited computational resources. And that's what makes attention beneficial and also makes it different from some other cognitive processes that it's sometimes studied with. So hopefully it's clear how that definition applies to what I'll be talking about. If you look at kind of all the different types of attention on this biology side as well as the machine learning side, and this isn't even all of them, this is just a sample, different types of attention have more or less similarity on in these two fields. And I want to first talk about examples where there is a lot of similarity and a lot of parallels, and that's mainly in the concept of visual attention. So in general, machine learning and biology has a lot of overlap when it comes to visual processing, just because convolutional neural networks are kind of loosely based on the structure of biological visual systems, the ventral visual stream in primates mainly. And so the way that attention has been defined and used in these artificial visual systems actually to the biology. So one example is saccades. So these are small eye movements that we all make several times per second, and they've been studied in psychology for decades, or over 100 years. And so basically, your eyes are darting around the scene constantly, and this is called overt spatial attention, because when you move your eyes, you're moving the location of your fovea, which has a high density of photoreceptors. So you kind of have this special computational resource, this very dense set of photoreceptors that you can choose to flexibly move around the visual system to choose kind of what information you want to sample more of. And it is very flexible.
Grace, do you hear us?
I think she froze out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't switching slides.
Yeah, she might appreciate being able to send if also her slides weren't changing.
Let me.
Yeah, this happens.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. I don't know. Given the time, I don't know if we should be following with your presentation, Felix, and see what's going on with Grace.
Yeah, I think that sounds like the best plan, and hopefully Grace can present.
Yeah.
After me.
Yes,
okay.
For sure.
Let's try that, and hopefully Grace comes back soon. So I'm just gonna find my tab. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. And it's, yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me. Debería saludar a todos los de México. La vez pasada di la plática en español, pero esta vez va a ser en inglés. But it's very nice. I lived in Mexico City for a year, so it's always a real pleasure to participate in the RIA. I'm going to talk a little bit about. So I have to confess, I'm not actually a neuroscientist, right? So I'm a computer scientist, but I do have a sort of master's in psychology. And I'm very interested in a particular topic, which is where are we with language learning in machines, and potentially how does that compare with language learning in humans? So actually, this is a really interesting example from GPT-3, which is an enormous language model produced by OpenAI, which has created a huge amount of interest, and justifiably so, I think. So with this enormous language model, we can actually prompt this model and kind of teach it in one shot the meaning of a new word, right? So in this case, the word is fardaddle, which doesn't mean anything in English. And if you just prompt the model with to do a fardaddle means to jump up and down really fast, an example of a sentence that uses the word fardaddle is, then GPT-3 will continue with. One day when I was playing tag with my little sister, she got really excited and she started doing these crazy fardaddles. So certainly a response like that gives an impression that this model is able to really learn about a new word and integrate that with its existing knowledge in a very fast way. And this is super impressive, right? The sort of thing that people often said neural networks would never be able to do. A lot of philosophers have discussed whether or not this isn't a sign of real understanding. So David Chalmers, who's one of the top sort of philosophers of mind and language in the world, asked some interesting questions about GPT-3. And he points out, along with other philosophers, that one of the things that that makes people think that this model isn't really understanding is that it doesn't. It's just making connections between words in text, and it doesn't necessarily understand how those things relate to the world. So lots of people have taken this as a justification for studying more grounded language learning. And that's certainly what I'm going to talk a little bit about in the time remaining. But it's interesting also to think about the panorama. This is a sort of spectrum of different people studying language learning in machines. So on the one side, you have the purely text-based language learning that GPT-3 does. And then there's people who study a sort of multimodal flavor of language learning that might be from a static data set, so things like video and image captioning. And then the work I do is somewhere in between that and studying language with a full-blown robot. So it's studying language learning in a simulated agent. I'd love to do it in a full-blown robot, but I'm not good enough at robotics. And in actual fact, it's very, very hard. We're not probably far enough forward in robotics, and certainly not in robot learning, to be able to do it in a way that I think would be interesting. So that's why most of my work is focused on this paradigm in simulation. And to get any sort of language learning going, we need a big neural network. We also need a simulated environment which can pass out a view of the world, so like a pixel view of the world, which depends on the agent's position. And that's passed out from the environment at every time step. And that's processed at every time step by a small convolutional neural network, which is the visual part of what I'm going to call the agent. The other aspects of the agent are a small language processing component, which learns to process strings. And the environment, as well as giving out pixels at every time step, is going to give out some strings. And then the signal from both of these, coming out of both of these neural networks, can be mixed together in some way and then integrated into a memory, because the agent's going to receive this information at every time step. So plausibly, the way that information changes over time can be useful for the agent to know about. And then at the end, the agent just needs to make a decision about what action to take. Now, in the environments that we use, typically there's a finite number of discrete actions, but it could be a continuous environment in which the agent can choose like a real valued number representing an action. Cool. So I'm going to try and convince you that it's worth studying language learning in this embodied paradigm. And one of the ways I'm going to do it is by showing you that the outcomes are different if you do learning based on a fixed data set or if you do it in an embodied agent. So this is a really simple visual question answering task. So I'm just going to train an agent to answer questions like, which side of the image is the red guitar on? And the answer here is the right side. Okay, the other side is like a purple guitar. And I'm going to train the agent using a very similar architecture to the one I just showed you, but I'm going to train it using supervised learning algorithms. So this is just a fixed data set of questions and answers like that, right? And when I do that, and also I'm interested in systematic generalizations. I want to know whether or not I can train the agent on some combinations of shapes and colors, and then see how it performs on some held out set of shapes and colors. So I do that. I train it on the color combination questions involving the combinations you see on the left-hand side of that table. And then I evaluate its performance on held out combinations. So here the agent has to, or the model has to be able to integrate its knowledge of certain colors with its knowledge of certain shapes and interpret questions that have combinations of shapes and colors that the agent's never seen before. So when we do that, we find that we can train this model perfectly. It scores 97% accuracy on the training data, and on the test data, that performance reduces to 78%, right? So there's some confusion in the model when you present it with combinations that it's never seen before. When we do exactly the same experiment, so we can do exactly the same experiment in the context of an embodied agent. So here, rather than giving it a question, we just give it an instruction. But the way that the agent answers is just has to choose to move forward and move up and bump into the object which corresponds to the correct thing. So at some high abstract level, this is exactly the same task. And we can do the same holdout thing. We can separate the training data and the test data into two halves. And the architecture we're going to use here is exactly the same, apart from in the final layer, where in this case, the agent chooses between one of 8 actions, fine-grained actions as it moves through the world, whereas in the other case, the agent was choosing between one of 2 possible answers, left or right. Okay, when we do that, we find that this agent generalizes perfectly on the held out instructions, right? So there's a difference in outcome from an embodied agent and one with exactly the same architecture, which was trained on a static data set. So it's not just the difference between being a static data set and being an embodied agent where we see these differences. It can also be in the case of 2 different embodied environments or like sort of behavior environments, we can get quite different outcomes. So here's 2 different environments. One of them is visually very rich and somewhat more realistic. The other one is a grid world. Okay. Now in these cases, we can also do a sort of generalization experiment. In this generalization experiment, we're going to study this task of putting an object in a particular place. So here's an object, here's an agent in the 3D, more sophisticated world, putting a plane on the bed, right? Now, here's the generalization test we're going to do. We're going to train the agent so that it knows the name of all the possible objects it could encounter in the environment. We're going to train it to lift any of the objects. Now, in the 3D world, you can probably imagine what that looks like. In the grid world, lifting is actually just moving the agent square over towards an object and pressing a single unitary action. So in doing that, in both environments, the agent learns the name of a set of, say, 10 possible objects, although there's only 3 objects in every episode. And then we're going to train the agent to do something, but we're going to train the agent to only do something with a finite subset, a proper subset of those objects. So we're going to train the agent to put only some of them on the bed. And in the grid world, putting on the bed means picking up the object, activating the pickup action, and then moving with a little square, moving it towards a destination where the agent can see the bed. I should add that in both environments, the initial position of the agent and all the objects is totally randomized on an episode-by-episode basis. What we see, as you can probably guess from the way I've set up the rhetoric of this talk, so here's a video of the 2 different environments. What we see is that, is basically that the agent that's trained in the more realistic 3D world generalizes with almost perfect accuracy, putting on the things onto a bed that it's never been trained to put onto the bed. In the grid world, we don't get anywhere near as good generalization. So you can see that here. From the blue line is the performance of the agent in the 3D world, the generalization performance of the agent on the 3D world. The orange line is the generalization on the grid world, which is only a little bit above chance. But so how do we explain this? Well, I'm very short of time, so I'm probably not going to be able to go into much details. But one thing we noticed was actually the key differentiating feature here is the egocentric nature of the perception. We can actually make the 2D grid world egocentric by putting a box around the agent as it moves. If we do that, we recover almost all of the difference in generalization performance that we observe between the 2D grid world and the more sophisticated 3D world. So that seems to suggest to us that the most important factor here with respect to generalization is the fact that the agent has an egocentric perspective. And that means that a lot more states in the environment look the same to it than they would if it was positioned in some sort of like omnipotent position above everything. And anyway, So I'll just quickly give you some conclusions. Yeah, so hopefully I've convinced you that we can actually train neural networks that jointly learn language, movement, and vision in a single model, and that doing this can lead to quantitatively and qualitatively different outcomes, even though we use the same architecture and we study problems that are at some abstract level exactly the same, right? So I like to think that this tells us about a really important principle in machine learning, which is that more is different, right? If the input is a lot richer, even if at some symbolic or logical level the task is exactly the same, the outcomes can be different. So doing science in a reductionist way does not always give us a solid explanation for the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. This is a point made by a Nobel Prize winner called P.W. Anderson in a very famous paper that's nothing to do with language in 1972, but I think it's all the more pertinent in light of really large neural networks which are being trained at the moment. And just in case you might point out that I didn't actually study any sort of real natural language in this work, I just studied like a symbolic template language. So if you really love natural language, we've recently combined our agent with like one of these big language models, and we're continuing to work in that direction. Anyway, I think I've run out of time, so thanks for your interest. And check out this review paper, which this is coming out in PNAS, if you want to read more about this whole topic of embodied language learning in humans and in AI. Cool.
Thank you, Felix. So we can try Grace again.
I'm nervous, but I'll try.
Don't worry, don't worry.
Let me try this one.
So can you stop sharing, Felix?
Yeah.
No problem.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just start a little bit in. So yeah, this was the definition that I came up with, the ability to flexibly control limited computational resources. The link to this review is in the chat, so if you want to know more, you can go there, and I'll go through this somewhat quickly. So I wanted to talk about some examples where there is overlap between biological and artificial attention, and that happens mostly in visual systems. So people move their eyes across images, and we call this overt spatial attention because you overtly move your eye and to move where you put your fovea, and then this is a way to control what information is coming into your visual system. And this has been studied a lot in psychology and neuroscience, but then there's this component in artificial systems called hard spatial attention, which is essentially the same thing. And in these systems, image is given to a network, but it doesn't get the whole image. It only gets a small section of the image that it gets in high resolution, and it might get low resolution versions of sections around that focal point. And basically you pass that through a convolutional neural network that ultimately wants to classify what's in the image, but it has a few chances to kind of make glimpses around the image. And so the output of the visual encoder goes to an attention selection network that picks a new location in the image to get another high resolution sample of. So this is basically the same thing as saccading across an image. And it serves the purpose of, in the artificial system, making it such that you can classify large high resolution images or images of different sizes, because you don't have to pass the whole image into the network. It can just make a few movements around and try to classify it based on that. We also have a type of attention in the visual system that doesn't require eye movements. So you can keep your eyes perfectly fixated forward, but you can still be told to attend to, say, one side of the visual field or the other. And if you're told to attend, say, to your right visual field, and a target that you're looking for shows up there, you will detect that target with higher probability than if you're told to attend to your left visual field and it shows up in your right visual field. So this is a type of covert spatial attention. There's no outward change in what we're doing or where our eyes are in the visual field. We're getting the same visual information coming into the system the whole time because you're not moving your eyes. But yet we have this ability to manipulate our visual system internally to detect things in different spatial locations with more or less accuracy. So it's flexible because you can put it in different locations, and it enhances processing in the location that you put this covert spatial attention. The analog to this in artificial systems is known as soft spatial attention. So again, in the artificial side, you put an input image into a convolutional network. Here you're putting in the whole input image, so that stays fixed throughout this process. But then the activity at a layer of the convolutional neural network can be reweighted iteratively to produce an output. In this example, they're producing a caption for the image. And so you can see that when different words are produced for this caption, different parts of the image are being attended. So the representation is being upweighted of different parts of the image. And so this is very similar to the covert spatial attention we had, because it's kind of just changing the weighting of the activity in the network, but nothing about what's going into the network is changing. So those are some examples where there is a clear parallel in the artificial side and the biological side. There's also examples in the biology that kind of don't have a parallel in the artificial side. So one example is overall arousal or alertness. Sometimes the word attention is used to just refer to kind of our general ability to engage in tasks. And this has been studied for a long time, and it's known that level of arousal does inform kind of your performance on a lot of different cognitive tasks. But interestingly, it's not just, oh, the more alert you are, the better you perform. There's actually this inverted U curve called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which says that basically if you have very low levels of arousal, so you're very tired or something like that, you'll perform poorly on cognitive tasks. And then there's a point where you'll perform at your best. And then after that, you'll actually get worse if you're kind of hyper alert or hyper aroused. It can be hard to focus. And so we actually have this this non-monotonic relationship between overall alertness and performance, or overall attention and performance. And interestingly, the anatomy of the system that is believed to control this overall level kind of reflects its function. So basically there's a nucleus in the brain called the locus coeruleus that releases a neurotransmitter, a neuromodulator, norepinephrine, that goes kind of all over the brain. It just is like globally released and is just kind of controlling the general state of the brain throughout all of the different systems. And so this makes sense because it's controlling kind of overall alertness. And this is something that we don't have a parallel for in artificial systems. We don't have something that kind of controls overall alertness in a deep neural network. And that's probably just because we kind of have these one-task systems at this point in time. But if you think about a future where we have more integrated AI systems that are doing multiple things and maybe need to even decide at some point that they need to kind of power down to recharge or something like that, you might imagine that you would need a system that controls the overall state of the AI. So this is kind of very future looking in terms of how AI can be inspired by neuroscience. So I also just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what I consider two main categories of things that AI can take from neuroscience in terms of attention. And so the first is how attention enhances performance. And so this would be like what actually happens in the brain when we attend to something. So when I tell you to attend to the right side of your visual field and you're able to detect things better than than if you were not told to attend there, what neurons in your brain change and how do they change and how does that make you better at that visual task? And this is what a lot of the neuroscience of attention is focused on, is what basically you tell the person what to attend to and then you look at their neurons and see how their neurons change when they attend to that. And we see changes across the visual system. This is showing examples from 3 different visual areas where neural activity is increased when attention is being deployed to the spatial location that this neuron represents. So this is definitely something that's studied a lot. And we could, for artificial systems, look to the findings here and say, oh, if you modulate neurons in such a way, it makes the system better at a task, and that can be helpful. But I actually think that the more useful thing to look to the neuroscience data from is how attention gets deployed. So not putting people in tasks where you tell them what to attend to and then see what happens, but just putting them in a naturalistic setting and see where their attention goes naturally. So this is kind of what's been done with some of the eye movement studies, where you just kind of show people an image and you track where their eye moves, and so you can look at where their attention is. And then people try to build artificial systems that can actually replicate the same pattern of eye movements that humans make and try to reverse engineer essentially what it is that human attention is trying to do. And I think that when you're trying to do this for anything other than eye movements, it's very hard. We don't know how to track covert attention. So eye movements are kind of the most straightforward thing that you can do this for. But in general, kind of figuring out not just how attention makes brains better at what they do, but how the brain decides what to attend to seems like the more interesting question to me, and the question that could be more relevant for developing artificial systems, because how we choose to deploy our attention is really important, and apparently kind of humans do it well enough to be a pretty smart species. So I think studying that question might be of more interest to an AI community. So just to conclude, attention has many meanings in both neuroscience and machine learning and in psychology. There are areas where there's strong parallels, and it's easy to kind of study them and look for even more inspiration once you've established those parallels. But there's also areas that are kind of wide open for bringing the biology into the artificial systems. And personally, I think that it might be useful for AI researchers to kind of look at how attention gets deployed as a way of inspiring new systems that might work even better than current ones. So thanks.
Thank you, Grace. So we will start with the Q&A. We have a ton of questions. So let me share my screen and present the most voted ones. So the first one is, where is the main difference between artificial and natural intelligence? That's a hard one, I think.
Artificial is done by machines. That's all that I know. That's the only difference that I know.
I mean, I think some of the points that Grace was making at the end about, you know, the ability, most artificial systems are trained on a single task, right? And can instantiate, you know, a certain type of learning paradigm, and real brains are flexible and able to do many different things. I mean, this is a hard question, of course, but I do think that the ability to flexibly move into different settings, generalize, and solve many different tasks is, I think, you know, still a major gap between what we have in a lot of artificial intelligence. And, you know, that's at least one direction, I think, where there's large gains to be made to get closer to biological brains.
Yeah, also brain plasticity, which we cannot mimic in artificial systems nowadays.
Also just point out as well that we could answer this by thinking about the model, how they are, but it's also, I think, insightful to just think that the stimuli, the learning experience of any AI is nothing like the learning experience of any animal. It's just like so far away from that like maybe we should be endeavoring to get our models a more richer experience. This is from an AI perspective. A more realistic or a richer experience, maybe that's just as important as developing better algorithms.
Okay, so let's take the next question then.
But can I just say something? So Felix, you showed
Sure.
that giving your agents a less rich experience was also useful.
Which bit?
Oh no, I was just talking about this egocentrism, right? So.
Oh yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, sorry. Maybe rich isn't the right word because it's also an absolute term. So yeah, maybe all I can claim is that let's try and make it more aligned with the experience of a biological learner.
Okay. So the next question is, what will be your advice for people that wants to do neuroscience-inspired AI? What to study first?
I'm inclined to say you should. I would say you should study the hard skills first. I studied neuroscience first, and then went into computational neuroscience, and I found it difficult to learn the math and the coding and all of that. And neuroscience is so big and confused, and you're never going to know all of it, and it's not clear how many hard facts there are to know. So maybe learn the AI side so you can actually build things, and then see what from neuroscience gets you inspired would be my advice.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think that if a person would like to build AI applications, then it's better to take several basic courses on neuroscience about how a brain works, and maybe some of these ideas, concepts can be developed in some AI systems. But
Okay, so I will abuse reading a question from one moderator, from Andres Campero. He's asking, do you think that AI can approach human intelligent capabilities mostly with a lot of scaling as GPT-3 could suggest, or are radical innovative ideas still needed?
I think there probably still needs to be new ideas. Sorry.
Is Ida there? I think Ida would maybe have a. I don't know if she's still there, but it'd be interesting to hear her.
So
I guess this is also kind of similar to the first question, right? Like, do we need more things, right? Or do we need to add, fundamentally different, systems or learning algorithms in order to push things forward, right? Is that sort of the question here? Do we need, is it just scaling, or do we need something else, right? I guess it depends on what our fundamental goal is. If it is to achieve some form of general intelligence, I guess it's not just scaling up, but.
okay.
I'd also just add that I sound like a broken record because I'm just repeating myself, but it's a point that I'm passionate about. Like, you can't just scale. I just don't see any success in scaling a model without scaling the data. Otherwise, that just seems completely futile. So we will, one potentially important thing to do is to work out how to get data to the learner that's rich enough and that contains the necessary stimuli from which to learn.
Yeah, but then it is the question of unsupervised learning, because in this case we have infinite amounts of data.
Well, I mean, if only if we have a sort of I don't think we have infinite amounts of data if we just have a 30-second video or something like that. It needs to be different. So whatever, I mean, it's true that we could, in theory, define an infinite number of unsupervised learning algorithms and apply them to the same 30-second video, but I'm not sure that would be sufficient.
Okay.
I think along those lines, the work in, self-supervise and these other representation learning systems has been interesting because you can create new data, right, through augmentations and train networks to figure out how you've augmented or changed the data. And that gives you this sort of sense that there's a lot more than what you started with. But I think still, you're only going to get as many invariances as what you put into those augmentations. So it's still limited. But I think it's exciting what people are doing in this space, and I still don't quite understand why it works. But I think there's a lot of progress. And especially in the stuff that we do in medical imaging where you have limited data, like Felix said, if you just have 30 seconds of a video, that's all you get, right? So you have to start using these more, other approaches to enrich your data set.
Controversial, I would say, until we have at least as much data as a biological learner receives, and in the same way, then I don't think it's a basis to conclude that our algorithms are insufficient. But lots of people have concluded that they are insufficient already.
Okay, so we will close the panel with this last question. So it's directed to Felix Hill. What are some good hints we can obtain from cognitive semantics for a better approaching of natural language understanding tasks?
Yeah, that's So when you say cognitive semantics, I'm going to presume that you're referring to like cognitive linguistics, this paradigm in linguistics that I would associate with Lakoff and Langaker. And so I don't know if that's correct, but just to say, I learned all about that type of linguistics in UNAM in Mexico with a professor called Ricardo Maldonado. And it was amazing. It changed my perspective on language completely. And I think that is a really nice perspective on language. And I think there's a lot actually that we can learn from that tradition in linguistics. In particular, I think one of the big things is that you can't separate like things like word order or what we might think of as syntax from semantics or the use of language, because these things are constantly interacting. So I actually think that like deep networks are a really good model of that type of linguistics, because they allow for an interaction between our long-term memory and how we choose to process the current input in a way that a more pipeline style, maybe different type of model of language processing, where you do parsing and then you do some sort of semantic processing as an independent process, that can't really account for all of these top-down effects that we see in language understanding, things like constructions, and all these other linguistic phenomena. So.
Okay. So there is anything that you want to add after closing the panel?
I just want to add one last thing. The question about, what should you do to, start to work in neuroscience and AI. And I just wanted to say that I think a lot of, departments and a lot of places are moving towards a sort of more convergent understanding of brains and artificial intelligence. And I agree with a lot of what Grace said about, having these hard skills and having the ability to, work in computer science and then apply that to neuroscience. But I think we're starting just to learn that, we can use very similar tools to understand both systems. And I think that this has been a really exciting time for, computational neuroscience, AI, and all of these convergences. So, yeah, I think there are more resources now available to students that want to start doing this and, kind of do it from the ground up in an interdisciplinary way. So hopefully that, that can be, yeah, people can get on board with the the fusion, right? So
yeah, so study machine learning, neuroscience, and be happy.
Okay, so well, we are very grateful to having you here, and I am glad we managed to conclude this panel session. So thank you everyone to be here supporting the Latin American AI ecosystem. Thank you. This is for everyone. This is representative of everyone.
Thank you.
So see you later, and thank you. So we can jump to the other talks. See you.